Hello, hello. It is Scott Hanselman and John Galloway and Damian Edwards, and we are talking about the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up. This is like now we've actually done this many times, haven't we, guys? This is like the
It's
seventh.
almost becoming a habit.
It's almost a thing. If only we would do them at the times we say we would do them.
Yeah, that would be, helpful to our viewers, I'm sure.
Yeah, I apologize. I have a doctor's appointment, so there you go. That's
There you
how
go.
transparent we are here. I will also share my blood work. I'll share my blood work on future. Damian, what do you have for us today?
Oh, wow. I'm writing up my notes here still. This will be much more like a traditional stand-up today because we have to keep it shorter, but that's good. Um, so VS14 CTP4 is out. It came out yesterday. Is that right? I think it was yesterday.
Mhm.
And I know people have been waiting for that for a while. I've been saying it's going to be out for a couple of weeks now. Well, it's here. Bunch of changes in ASP.NET vNext inside there. One of them is a hint towards a name change, which I'll talk about in just a minute for the astute among you. The biggest one is the www root support landed. So we talked about the web root or www root feature in this stand-up meeting, 4 weeks ago, I think. And so that's there now. That's in the templates by default. It's supported in Project JSON. When you launch the new ASP.NET vNext project, it'll launch with IS Express rooted at that folder. So again, just to refresh people's minds, that means that only files that are inside that www root folder will be served by the web server. So it means your code files, are not in there, obviously, because they're not web files. And your views aren't in there because they're compiled, obviously, by the K runtime or the ASP.NET runtime. And so it's a model we're experimenting with. We've seen the model in other web platforms. It does solve a category of problems, but it is a new concept, so we want people's feedback on it. I will say that we're refining the templates for beta, which is going to be the next release. And we're making some improvements, which I'll talk about a little bit in just a moment. But a www root is there, and we need people to have a look at that and let us know what they think. On the name change, we changed the monikers that we use to denote or represent the frameworks inside your project JSON file. So you would have seen previously we had this K10 moniker and Net45, I think were the two monikers we used. We now have some new ones. We have ASP.NET 50 or ASP.NET 5.0 and ASP.NET Core 5.0. So no prizes to anyone who might guess what we might end up calling this thing now that those monikers are in the project.json file. But they are working titles, and marketing is a fickle beast, so that thing could change. But right now, ASP.NET 5.0, ASP.NET Core 5.0 are the two sort of target frameworks that are available to you when creating vNext. Now, I'm sure some people will have some thoughts about what that means. It's just a name. It's just a version. I wouldn't get too wound up in it. But that's the names that we're going with right now. We had to come up with some names so that in preparation for getting our packages live on the actual NuGet feed on nuget.org. We can't go with the old names because they conflict. We have to go with some new, unique names so we can get the NuGet experience that we want, which will be coming.
That 5.0 matches up with .NET 5.0. Is that kind of the...
Well,
that has not been announced. We don't
that
know.
has not been announced. We don't have any announcements around .NET.
And I was just trying to guess because we've got MVC 6, right?
There is no way to know what number comes after 4.
That's true.
It is. I mean, just like Windows. I mean, you really can't tell what number is going to be next.
No, but in all seriousness, the marketing aspect of stuff, like obviously there's going to be a number that's going to have a 5 somewhere.
Somewhere.
But you've got the formerly K runtime to think about. You've got a lot of matrices to figure out. We're actually actively trying to figure that stuff out right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the 5, I mean, just to be totally transparent, the 5 here is meant to denote ASP.NET 5. ASP.NET traditionally has versioned with the .NET framework because it's shipped with the .NET framework. Obviously, that's not what's happening now. We're being very open about that. We started that with MVC and Web API and Signaler. We're not with the .NET framework anymore. And this is the first time ASP.NET as a full stack has been completely separate from sort of the traditional .NET framework install, but it still represents sort of version 5. And the previous version of ASP.NET, the full stack was in the .NET Framework 4.5 and then 4.5.1 and then this year 4.5.2. But this is our first time as a standalone stack, so we've got a new major version number. But again, all up, it could change again. So, but that's what we're going with for this CTP.
All right.
Another big change was the rename of the iBuilder interface. Now, this is the interface that's passed into your startup class, into the configure method, and it's the one that you use to configure your HTTP pipeline, so what middleware you're going to run, what app frameworks you're going to run, and obviously, very importantly, what services are going to be injected into the environment's DI container. That's now called iApplication Builder. Which is a little more similar to what we had in the Katana world, where we had iApp Builder. Now, we didn't want to use the exact same interfaces because we think that creates more confusion than it solves. So now we have a third name. We had iApp Builder, then iBuilder, and now it's iApplication Builder. So that changes there and in the templates. There was a lot of work done on tooling performance in the CTP4. One of the biggest changes was one of the features of ASP.NET Next, obviously, is that it's always compiling in the background. We have this symmetry between design time, compile time, and runtime compilation. And what happens in the tooling now is, as you're coding in Visual Studio, there's this component called the design time host that is compiling your code in the background, and that actually feeds into the IntelliSense engine to give you squigglies and all that type of stuff. Well, since that compilation has already happened in the design time host, when you hit F5 or Control F5 to launch the browser, launch IS Express and launch the browser, we don't recompile your application, not even in memory. What happens is the new process is started to run your application, but it's given an argument that says, hey, there's already this place over here on this machine in memory where these assemblies for this app have already been compiled. It actually uses a TCP with a loopback, and it says, basically connect to this port over here into this design time host process that VS was using, and get your assembly bytes directly from this port. So we have kind of these three parties. We have devinf.exe, which is Visual Studio. We have a design time host exe, which is hosting all the ASP.NET VNext stuff, and that's running while you're coding in VS. Then when you launch IS Express, the third process comes along to join the party, and it doesn't have to do anything from scratch. It just gets all the precompiled stuff from that design time host. Nothing hits disk. It's all done in memory and through virtual I/O. So that's a pretty cool change, and that results in much faster transition times between I'm working in Visual Studio and now I'm looking at my code in the browser. So again, we'd love to get feedback on that. People need to try that, make changes, switch over to the browser, see how it feels. And we now have a whole team dedicated just to that sort of performance element of coding in ASP.NET VNext. So,
and do you have a sense about, like, there's the Hello World, like Northwind, speedy example, but then there's the I'm an enterprise with 70 solutions kind of scenario?
Yeah, it's a work in progress. I mean, I'll be totally honest. We're still working very hard on a bunch of metrics and a bunch of scenarios. I mean, some of the really important ones are cold start. So how long does it take once I do file new after I've started VS the first time to get the thing open in the browser? Then there's once it's warm, if I make a change to code and I alt-tab back to the browser and hit F5, how long does that take? What's the difference between doing it on .NET Framework versus doing it on .NET Core? Because obviously they're very different runtimes. And so we're working on a lot of those metrics and a lot of those scenarios. And we just continue to obviously work to get those better and better and better. And we're still very early. I mean, we haven't even done the beta yet. The beta will be the next release. But we're not looking to ship RTM until well into next year, which we've said multiple times. So expect it to get better. We are now actually looking at this as a priority. Previously, we'd still been bedding down functionality. Now we do have a team looking at performance. NuGet dialog support is new, so now in CTP4 you can right mouse click on an ASP.NET VNext project, you can say manage NuGet packages and get the familiar NuGet dialog and manage packages that way. Previously you had to do it all in Project JSON. You had IntelliSense, which was really nice, we haven't had that before, but now you can do it using the familiar dialog. And we're actually redoing the dialog completely for beta, so we actually have a brand new NuGet experience coming in Visual Studio. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about beta in just a moment. Lastly, if you're working on CTP4, if you've gone to the GitHub site, ASP.NET/home, you would have seen the instructions there on how to get started on a machine by installing KVM, or the K version manager. Remember, K is sort of the Project K moniker, which is also ASP.NET VNext, so we have a lot of tools that start with K. KVM is what you use to maintain and manage the version of the K runtime you have on your machine. And so if what you might find is that if you've done file new and then you go into the project JSON and you change those version numbers in your dependencies from being a hard-coded version number to a star because you want to be on the bleeding edge, you want to get builds from our dev branches as they happen, you'll get broken a lot because we do make breaking changes quite a bit, day to day. And the way to fix that on your machine, the most often when I get is I'll get a method missing exception when I run my app. It'll work in Visual Studio, and then when I run my app, I get a method missing, a big blue screen of death in my browser. Generally, the fix for that is to go to a command line and type kvm space upgrade, and that will update your sort of core ASP.NET VNext runtime, or the KRE, the K runtime environment. It'll update that to the latest version and set your machine to use that version by default, because you can actually have more than one version installed on your machine at the same time. That's one of the great features of ASP.NET VNext. And so you have to kind of think about managing these versions. Now, obviously, once we go to 1.0, this thing won't be changing very often. Now, right now, it changes from day to day because we're in active development. Once we go to 1.0, this will change much less frequently, and you won't have these problems. And even before 1.0, a lot of these APIs will start freezing. But right now, we still get breaking changes from teams like Roslyn, the new compiler as a service, which we take a very big dependency on. We get breaking changes from them every week or so, and that fundamentally breaks the K runtime environment. So we have to fix that, and that then flows onto all the frameworks, Razor, which does runtime compilation. And so you'll often find yourself having to type KVM upgrade to get yourself up to date. So just want to let people know that if they wanted to use the latest stuff, they need to be aware of that.
Great. Hey, we've got a lot of great questions. Is now a good time to jump in with some of those?
Sure, let's do that now before I talk about beta.
Okay, so Adam asks, is it safe to install Visual Studio 14 CTP4 alongside or side by side with VS 2013? And if he has CTP3 installed, does he need to uninstall, or is it in place upgrade?
So safe is a relative question, sort of concept, right? I mean, what's safe to one person can be disastrous to another. No, I mean, the official answer is no. The official answer is we don't support the community previews. They're not intended to be installed on production machines like your main box. I have them installed on my Surface here and on my desktop next to VS 2013, but when things go wrong, which they do, I have the team in the next room to help me fix it. So I wouldn't really recommend people put it on their main machines. For the CTP4, I would suggest people still stick to putting it on a VM, unless you're willing to try and work through issues. If you have a problem, grab the install log and send it through, and maybe people will help you, but no support officially.
Great. Okay, Eric asks, in the past we had debug, release, whatever config, and we could do web config transforms.
Yep.
And is that still supported in the new JSON any XML configuration model?
That's a great question.
Okay.
We should do a stand-up on that next week. So we should do a stand-up on what we call environmental awareness next week. So we have a new feature in ASP.NET VNext, which is basically this first-class concept of your application knowing what environment it's in. And that's flowed through from the underlying host. And the simplest way to set that is with an environment variable. So there's actually a named environment variable. We have a whole bunch where you can change behavior. One of them lets you set the environment name. And by default, an environment defaults to production. When VS launches your application, it automatically sets it to development. And then you can create any names that you like. So you can have a staging environment, a test environment, a UAT environment, whatever environment you like. And you can program against those environments in your startup.cs. And so it's a slightly different approach to previously, because we had this configuration system before that was declarative but backed by classes and programmatic kind of stuff. In the new world, our config system is name value pair, and you sort of compose the configuration sources as the first step in your startup code. You do that imperatively. And then you kind of flow those config values into the various option systems for the frameworks you're using. So you can just use very simple conditional logic to say, hey, am I in production? Do this. Oh, I'm in development. Do that. Enable that. So we should do a talk on that. We should do a stand-up on that next week. I'll set that up because that's a really good concept to talk about.
Great. Okay, let's take two more real quick, and then we'll let you get back to what you were doing. So Nick asks, what hooks do we have to tie into constant compilation? For instance, it's just moving. For example, we generate additional CS files via Roslyn for high-performance runtime localization on Stack Overflow and need local dev to still work, of course. Does that make sense?
No.
So he wants to be able to tie into the compilation that's happening with Rosalind and
Oh, yes. Okay, so we're calling that the meta programming sort of feature set. So we do
Mhm.
have it. So at the moment, the hooks for that do exist, but there's no tooling support for it. So it's a little hard to get involved with that right now, but you can do it. There are hooks in the KRE, which is the runtime environment. I think it kind of boots your application and does the compilation. There are hooks in there where you can drop files in your application and configure them in Project JSON that says, hey, I want this code to party on the compilation of my application. Give me the syntax tree, give me the things, and let me sort of change stuff before you go ahead and run the app. So I don't have a lot of details on that. It's still fairly early on. We do use it internally. So we have things like not null attributes in our code so that we can do meta programming or abstract-oriented type stuff, or aspect-oriented, sorry. But that hasn't really been cooked yet. But we are going to support that.
Great. Okay, one last one from Joel. He said, you mentioned the NuGet experience you wanted to get. Does that include planning for Semver 2.0, NuGet 3.x?
Yes, so you can there's actually a blog post from Jeff Handley, the dev lead on NuGet. He talked exactly about Semver 2, I believe, last week, or maybe it was a tweet. I think it was a tweet that linked to a blog post. So yes, they're looking at Semver as part of NuGet 3, Semver 2.
Great. Okay, I'm done annoying you. Get back to your your
Get back
talk.
to my spiel. All right.
Yeah.
So I wanted to. So that's CTP4. So I mean, we want people to go and install it, give us their feedback. That's always goodness. So right now we're now working towards the first beta release. You can see that in the active code branches that we're working on now. Again, we can't really hide any of this stuff anymore because all the names are there in GitHub. And I wanted to talk about some of the features that we've spoken about previously in this meeting, and sort of their status. So the first one is tag helpers. I spoke about tag helpers a few weeks ago. That still hasn't hit the main branch yet. We're still doing the final round of code reviews on that. It's a fairly large feature, as you can imagine, so there's quite a lot of code that's being reviewed internally, but we do expect that to land in the main dev branches within the next week or so. So people who have been waiting to play around with tag helpers in the very, very early stages will be able to do that soon. And in terms of what will ship in beta, we plan on having the tag helpers feature as a thing in beta, and then a handful of actual tag helpers for you to use. Right now, I believe we're looking at getting a tag helper for form, a tag helper for the input tag. They're the two top candidates, and potentially for text area. And if we can stretch it a little bit, we would get an action link style tag helper, so one for the anchor tag. And these are basically the moral equivalents of the HTML helpers for form and text box and checkbox and radio button and those type of things. So we're looking to get that in. The other one that we're working on right now, which goes back to something Hanselman talked previously, was the Bower, Grunt, NPM support inside Visual Studio, and updating our ASP.NET VNext project templates to use those things by default. So we had a breakthrough just this last week in how we were sort of simplifying that whole thing. And so for preview, you should see file new for ASP.NET VNext. We'll use Bower to bring in jQuery and Bootstrap and possibly jQuery Validate to support MVC. And it will use Grunt and subsequently NPM, because NPM or Node Package Manager is the how you manage what Grunt tasks you have, because they're the dependencies. Grunt is built on Node, inside file new. And so you'll have a Grunt file set up with the Grunt Bower task, which is the most popular Grunt task in the community for managing Bower packages in your project. It automates the installation of the Bower packages you have defined, and it automates the copying of the files that you want from those Bower packages into your project, in this case into dub-dub-root, so you can actually use them. So we're working on that right now. David Fowler and I did a spike on this late last week. Some people may have seen me tweet a link to a repository in my GitHub account where we kind of have the summary of that. I think it's at /DamienEdwards/vnext Bower Grunt, which is a sample ASP.NET VNext project that shows how we're thinking we're going to integrate these things in file new. And that's the current plan of record. That's what we're working towards. So if people want to have a look at how we're looking at composing those things together, I encourage them to take a look at that. So One of the things right now is if you're going to go and use that, there is a known performance issue in Visual Studio's project system when you start using Grunt and Bower. Basically, when you use these Grunt task that we're using, you end up with about 9,000 files underneath your project because of the NPM packages it brings in, and that causes some performance issues in the project system, which we're working through right now. We'll have those solved for beta, but if you're doing it right now, you may see some freezes in VS where the UI takes about a minute or so to come back. It does come back, but it does freeze for a minute or so, so it's a little painful right now, but we're working through that. On the impact to NuGet, which is what Scott was asking before, we have spoken to a bunch of customers. We've been doing a bunch of customer visits about ASP.NET VNext, and we've spoken to them about their use of NuGet, and we have heard that a lot of customers are using NuGet internally for component distribution in their applications, and that sometimes includes content files. So NuGet supports a whole bunch of different file types, supports assemblies in the lib folder, and supports content or static files in the content folder. Unfortunately, NuGet's support for content files is pretty limited. You can't change where the files get laid out in your project. You can't. You have to check the files in. You can't really restore them at open or build time like you can with the assemblies, where NuGet restore pulls down the packages at the time that you open the project and then they get compiled. That doesn't work with content. So it's very limiting. You're kind of sort of limited to what the package author decided, where these files should go in your project. And so in ASP.NET VNext, because NuGet is integral to sort of the boot up process of an application, there isn't support currently for content files. So if you try to bring in the jQuery NuGet package into an ASP.NET VNext project, it won't fail, but you won't get any files in your project. What we're looking at doing is we've talked about adding a shim, so there would be something that you could add to a project that would be available from us. It would be a command that you could add to your project that could be invoked as part of the post-restore step. We have a bunch of steps in ASP.NET VNext, and one of them is after the packages have been restored. You could invoke a command that would effectively mimic the old NuGet content behavior into your ASP.NET VNext project. So that's kind of how we're thinking of bridging that divide right now. So for people who have taken an investment or taken a bet on NuGet's current content behavior, we will do some work to sort of make that flow over into VNext, but it won't be there by default. Instead, as I've already alluded to, the project templates will be defaulting to using Bower for their client packages, including Bootstrap and jQuery, jQuery Validate, eventually Angular, and other types of client frameworks that you might want to bring in. And then the using of Grunt in order to facilitate the copying of those files into the project, and also things like doing JS hint, so for doing JavaScript linting, or less, Grunt contrib less for doing less compilation, or Sass compilation. We'd be looking at using Grunt to do that. Now, I know a lot of people prefer Gulp, and in the client development space, that's because one of the problems with embracing the existing tools is that there aren't as many clear winners. A lot of the times in these spaces, there are two competing sets of tools or libraries that really don't have a clear winner. And we have to choose something to ship in the templates, but we will support more than one. So the Grunt support that we've talked about previously, the new Task Runner Explorer, which is the tooling support we have in VS for Grunt, will support Gulp as well. In fact, we already have a prototype of that, which is available. Mads has been tweeting about that. But as it stands right now, Grunt will be the one that we're picking to use in file new, but that's not to say that by the time we ship next year or an update after that, we won't give you the choice out of the box. And maybe in file new, you'll be able to tick a box and say, hey, I actually want to use Gulp. I don't want to use Grunt, or whatever new one comes out after that. So,
cool. So we've got to call it right now. We did our half an hour. Couple extra questions. Maybe we should follow up in the comments on the YouTube. Questions about tag helpers as it relates to some of the other ways that things like Fubu have done HTML tags, timelines on betas and stuff like that. Continue to ask questions in the YouTube, and we will continue to follow up as we can. And feel free also to ask questions for us on Twitter. And if you have issues, though, we want those on GitHub, don't we?
Yeah, if you've got actual issues where you've got repro steps or sample code that you think is behaving incorrectly, log it in GitHub in the appropriate repository.
Fantastic. All right, cool. Again, you can always get the playlist for these at www.asp.net/vnext, and we will attempt, except for today, to do these at 10 a.m. Pacific and 4 p.m. Pacific, alternating every other week. The calendar, again, up at asp.net/vnext. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.